it's really important that when we have conversations like this, they're rooted in fact. I know you don't want to hear this because the truth burns. It was crazy. Like, what are you talking about? That's slander. Hopefully this will bless your life and change it. What is going on was a year? That's definitely 2020. We are in the final stretch of the presidential campaign season, and we can definitely tell. This is the time where campaigns become less and less about substance and more about the gates. All hailing from Watergate, which is one of the biggest political scandals in which a president has ever been involved, COVID-gate, Emoluments Gate, No Ethics Gate, Ukraine Gate, Russia Gate, and the whole ass Trump Gate. Oh, and BLM Gate. Hold up, how does Black Lives Matter even have a gate?
But somewhere I read.
The president's personal lawyer said,
Yeah, I can't understand why major American corporations are giving money to Black Lives Matter, which is run by 3 communists who are avowed terrorists. The money that they get comes from a terrorist named Susan Rosenberg, who was convicted and sent to prison for 58 years for being involved in a conspiracy to kill cops. She's funneling the money to them. If you just spend 10 minutes, Martha,
no, I know.
and read what they stand for.
And it's not, it's not.
They stand for the end of our government.
All lies, and of all people, Rudy Giuliani should know exactly what terrorism is after the crisis in New York experienced with 9/11. And that is exactly how it starts, y'all. Students of recent history are fully aware of the connection Rudy Giuliani has with the tragedy of 9/11. So if he says something is terrorism, it should be, right? Wrong. And so here we are at the gate of BLM deception. We are at that point in the campaign season. What point, you ask? The point where the boogeyman takes the lead role. It's a low-down, dirty campaign tactic preying on the fears of the desperate, tapping into the worst deep-seated prejudices or the places where our bigotry or hatred lies. It's actually used on a bipartisan basis, and unfortunately, we're at a time in our nation's history where it's going from bad to worse. One way the infamous boogeyman strategy works, you get a persuasive voice to say something authoritatively about a subject that breeds irrational fear in the listener, and you have yourself a hook. You tell a chronically underserved, unemployed community that undocumented people are stealing their jobs, despite data saying the very opposite. You have a fake billionaire ask for Barack Obama's birth certificate because some folks have deep-seated bigotry about a different American story. You attack the first Somali American woman in Congress, Ilhan Omar, by saying she danced on the anniversary of 9/11. Do you see the pattern? The oppressor targets the oppressed by tapping into a fear of becoming the most marginalized, a fear of difference, a fear of losing power to others. And that othering helped Donald Trump gain a perceived victory in 2016 because of a desperate desire to keep a stranglehold on power. That desperate desire will say anything. It will do anything absent a single solitary fact to malign heroes, leaders, activists, and people who have carried the culture on their backs to ensure we make it to freedom and liberation. So we find ourselves knocking on the doors of BLM Gate. Trump and his team decided that the scariest thing to say this year is Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization and they want the opposite of law and order. Meanwhile, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project analyzed more than 7,750 Black Lives Matter demonstrations in all 50 states and Washington, D.C., and found that 93% of the protests were peaceful. That's the opposite of violent for the people in the back. Turns out that marches and protests do not count as terrorist activity unless you have a really wounded, fragile ego. I will talk about why the phrasing law and order is triggering to many of us who have the DNA of Black ancestors running through our veins, hearkening back to the era of slave patrols on another rant. But today on BLM, how can you demonize something when you don't even know what it is? And isn't it fascinating that they choose to demonize a movement called Black Lives Matter? They say it's not the movement, it's the organization. We should not tolerate the maligning of any of our people who have laid down their lives for Black Lives to matter. But you, I'm gonna deal with you in a minute. So what is BLM? Black Lives Matter Global Network is first exactly that. It's global. Its founders and co-creators are Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors. They were recently named to Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in 2020. Yep, that's them. They were also named to Time's 100 Women of the Year in March. Yep, that's them too. Alicia is an activist, strategist, podcast host, the founder of Black Futures Lab. Her organization developed a legitimate Black agenda born out of a survey of more than 30,000 Black people all over the country. And she's the author of a new book, The Purpose of Power. You should order it now because they will be real scared when her ass is on the New York Times bestsellers list. So let's work to scare them. Patrisse Cullors is an artist, an educator, author, political strategist, and organizer. The founder of Dignity and Power Now and the founder and chair of Reform LA Jails. Nigerian-American Opal Tometi is an advocate, strategist, writer, the former executive director of the United States' first national immigrant rights organization for people of African descent. There's no Black Lives Matter movement without movement leaders, which means you cannot separate the organization from the movement. Stop falling for that. BLM is not a part of Antifa. BLM is not a terrorist organization just because you are afraid of Black people finally realizing and walking in their power. BLM is not trying to dismantle the nuclear American family. This isn't a Marxist organization, nor is it a hub for rioting and looting. Note, supporting and affirming the LGBTQIA community does not mean the destruction of the nuclear American family. But radical? Perhaps. Radical because where we should be as a people looks radically different than where we are right now. Is it too radical for us to tell you we matter? The same Trump administration that y'all are negotiating with right now deliberately targeted Black Lives Matter protesters as domestic terrorists. The sentences associated with the alleged crimes are stiff, and more importantly, they're labeling protesters as BLM when they don't know who they are. Listen.
Arrested and charged for conspiracy under, say, RICO, like the heads of the mafia families were.
Well, this is something I've talked to the AG personally about, and I know that they are working on it. Look, we've seen about 300 arrests across this country regarding civil unrest and protesting, violent protesting, I would say, criminal protesting, criminal rioting occur. About 300 arrests. About a third of those or 100 of those arrests have been in Portland specifically. And I know the Department of Justice has charged about 74 or 75 individuals there in Portland with different federal crimes. And we'll continue to see how those investigations are going. The Department of Justice is also targeting and investigating the head of these organizations, the individuals that are paying for these individuals to move across the country. What we know, Tucker, is that we have seen groups and individuals move from Portland to other parts of the country.
Right.
We had about 175 arrests in Kenosha. Almost 100 of them were from out of state.
Why say BLM? The boogeyman strategy, of course. But also note he said leaders and funders. That overly broad language is dangerous. It gives them cover to go after people like the heroes I named. They have not distinguished agitators from paid actors. In other words, the disruptors from actual trained organizers. Law enforcement in some instances is also acting as an agitator. You don't believe me? Where do I start?
He's sitting in front of him.
First girl puts on her mask, sprays her.
Then the other, and finally dominant.
Hey! Hey! He's not doing anything!
I'm sure you're sitting at home saying, hey, I've heard of this before. You absolutely have. It sounds like some old COINTELPRO type-ish, doesn't it? The oppressor will always seek to destroy people and organizations who empower people. Remember Malcolm and Assata, and Huey and Martin Luther King. Not to mention, if you hear enough that your Black life doesn't matter, and that an organization that was designed to ensure you matter isn't actually for you, you begin to question its legitimacy. Especially if you already wrestle with the slave mentality that has chipped away at your worthiness for generations. If we're being real here, The real boogeyman is white supremacy. This isn't news to me, and I hope it's not news to you. Trump refuses to condemn white supremacy, or as I call it, white domestic terrorism or white toxicity, because we gotta call it what it is. Even then, followers continue to protect his behavior. He hasn't done enough to distance himself from white nationalist groups. If you watch the presidential debate, he hesitated and refused to condemn white terrorism on the global stage. Why is saying Black Lives Matter such an issue? Why hesitate to affirm the significance of Black lives? 401 years later, and you still can't even acknowledge this truth. Say it with me. Black Lives Matter. No arguments. Say it with your chest. And if you honestly have an issue with this affirmation, then you're blind, baby. You're blind from the facts. You scared of Black Lives Mattering? Of me mattering? Just wait till my people really start realizing our worth and hit you with that back pay for ancestral support, which you most definitely owe us. Hashtag, we built this joy for free. Thank God it's 2020 and we can see clearly now. Try it out. I highly recommend it. We have to protect our interests at all costs. We can't do that without truth. While Trump is telling the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by, I'm telling Black Lives Matter supporters everywhere to stand up and speak out. To people who fell for boogeyman, A2 Mark Cuban, don't believe the hype. Do not allow disinformation, deception, and dog whistles to define this movement. Be better, do better. Recommit your life to these facts because it's above him now. Black Lives Matter forever.